right. We're under the bright lights here. Well, Steve, thanks for joining us with this fireside chat. I think it's a really interesting topic. Maybe start by describing your role at AXA today, and then we'll go on a little bit of a journey back in time to talk about some of the origins of sort of the previous wave of AI and some lessons we can learn from that.
Great. Thanks, Tom. Thanks for having me here today. My name is Stephen Watson. I am the Chief Technology Officer for AXA, and I help guide the technology strategy for AXA. And I think we were talking earlier a little bit about those previous waves of AI. And during 2018 timeframe, my role at AXA was head of data architecture. So lots of interesting things are repeating themselves as we go through this new wave.
Perfect. Yeah, and I think for this session, we want to talk about what's similar to that first wave, if we call it, or the most recent wave, maybe better said, since AI has been around for decades. What's different, and then lessons learned. So maybe we'll start by talking about that most recent wave. 2018, we have sort of the dawn of things like deep learning, and companies are well into their data strategy. The data scientists are really having their moment. What was that like at the time in terms of what expectations were met, and what surprised us a bit in that most recent wave around AI when we really hit that peak of expectations around 2018 or so?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing was understanding where we were in the hype cycle and managing those expectations, and how do you maintain the appropriate focus and investment when that trough of disillusionment happens, because it's not as easy as everyone says it is.
So when enterprises started to embrace AI in that time frame, I think there was a lot of excitement around the possibilities, but pretty quickly it became clear that it was less a data science problem, more a data engineering problem. So talk about the role of data in AI at that time, and maybe roll that forward a little bit. What's similar to today, and what's different about today when it comes to the actual underlying data?
Yeah, there's a lot of talk about AI, but at the end of the day, it comes down to your data. That was true of the last wave. It's true of this wave. Unless you're looking to do very generic tasks, you need to make it relevant to you, to your company, to your users. That means it needs your data, which means that the importance of your data strategy is elevated. Because if you don't know where to find your data, or which data is the right data to use, then the AI becomes less meaningful. And we saw this when we were starting down the predictive analytics path, and we're seeing this again in the Gen AI realm as well.
So your role in 2018 was super relevant there, data architecture. What were some of the things that became clear when the enterprise was coming to you saying, hey, we want to embrace AI, are we ready to do that? How did you think about reprioritizing the data architecture to lay the foundation for taking advantage of, at that time, was deep learning and that first wave of AI in the enterprise, coming on the backs of decades of sort of traditional machine learning. Talk about some of the piece parts there: compute, storage, data architecture. How did you have to attack that?
Yeah, there were a couple of big technological hurdles or barriers that were lessened in that time frame. One of them being the rise of big data technology, moving to more commodity storage, commodity compute, open data formats. Whereas before that, it was a really big initial investment in an appliance that could process a large volume of data. So there was a transition away from that, and then as the rise of cloud computing made that ability to store and compute data even easier to access, an even smaller initial investment. What that impact was from a data architecture perspective is, how do we lay the foundations to adopt those new big data technologies and make that available in the cloud but it doesn't change the fundamental underlying data strategy, because the technologies will continue to evolve, but it still comes back to you need to know where is your data, what is good data, how do I ask questions of my data.
So we're 6 to 10 years down the road from that. When you think about big enterprise, which you're in, what lessons were learned successfully then, if you fast forward to today, and maybe where didn't we come as far as we needed to take advantage of generative AI?
There is a heavy reliance on building out your core data products within the enterprise. Because what happens is every initiative that would pop up that we wanted to do for AI, we would say, all right, well, I need this data in order to build that AI. And if you're tackling it from scratch, then you end up spending about 80% of your time just finding and preparing the data rather than focusing on building those models. And we saw that in the last wave, and we're seeing it again in this wave, but it's only gotten more complicated. The last wave was really heavily focused on how do we use structured data to make predictions. And now with generative AI, there's a lot bigger focus on unstructured data. And we need to expand our data strategies to include unstructured data.
How does unstructured differ from structured in terms of how you build your data strategy? Is it, hey, I can still use the same architectures, the same investments I've made in cloud and storage, or does it fundamentally change sort of your data supply chain when you think about unstructured versus structured?
The good news is it doesn't fundamentally change. It's what do you need to do to augment. So your structured data is still valuable, right? We don't want to get rid of that. We still need to maintain that. But we now need to leverage unstructured data alongside our structured data. And from a storage and compute perspective, not a whole lot of difference. But the classification of that data is much more complex. The understanding the quality of that data is much more complex. And understanding how you get to the sub-pieces of that unstructured data that are the most valuable or most relevant to what you're trying to do is a little bit more complex. So we've complexified the problem, but it hasn't fundamentally shifted or altered what we need to do.
When you think about the business as, in a sense, often your internal customer, talk about the differences and similarities between the business's role in sort of defining the problem in 2018, sort of AI versus 2024 Gen AI. Is that still the same? Do you feel like business is more or less empowered now? How does their role in helping you prioritize how you think about things at XXL change?
It always should start, I say should, doesn't always, but it always should start with the business problem that you're trying to solve. And that hasn't changed. That is still something that we need to be engaging with the business and understanding where are their pain points, where are their opportunities to create efficiencies. But we also need to help educate the business as to some of the new opportunities for how they could maybe do things in a different way.
Is the evolution from sort of, you and I were talking this morning about rolling back 15 years, getting your hands on something like machine learning was a big lift, right? It was heavy compute, very challenging data requirements, deep expertise required. Now, fast forward with Gen AI, and in many ways, prompting, probably everyone in the audience has at least tried prompting. Maybe a good percentage of the audience is using it even daily. So that's an extreme democratization of access to AI. Talk a little bit about how governance and regulatory has sort of changed from 6 years ago to today, and how does that infuse the approach you take when you're trying to meet the business's needs with data and technology?
Governance is always playing catch up with technology. You mentioned 15 years ago. I think any of you who were working in insurance technology 15 years ago, if you think back to how many controls you had to comply with then versus how many controls you have to comply with now, is a completely different world. And
Far greater, you're saying?
Far greater number of controls, far greater complexity of what we have to evidence. And that's not a bad thing. Those controls are there to protect us as employees, as companies. It's there to protect our customers, because at the end of the day, it is their data or it is our data, depending on what the domain of the data is. And that is something that can create risk. Insurance companies were trying to cover risk, not create risk. But that is, there are new things with each wave that we need to consider, right? When we started doing reporting with data, very simple questions that we're trying to answer, the questions were more about, is that accurate data for reporting? Are my financial statements correct? Am I giving a correct picture of the company? And we need to make sure that we had the appropriate level of controls for that. But then as we start making predictions or decisions off of that data, well, not only do I have to govern where I got my data and is it accurate, but what kind of model did I use to make that prediction or to make that decision? And did that model introduce bias into the process? And now as we move towards Gen AI, we're moving from deterministic models, which is if I enter the same inputs into a model, I always get the same outputs, to non-deterministic models, where I could call the same model twice with the same inputs and get two different answers. So how do I explain to a regulator that, well, this could tell me two different things if I give it the same inputs? And what are the things we need to track? Not just what was the data, but what was the prompt I used? What were the instructions that I used? What data did I embed in that prompt in order for the model to come back with a result? So it is getting much and much more complex. We're getting more powerful tools, but we have to put more controls in place.
Yeah, it's a great segue as we think about we're sort of evolving from a very data-centric technology strategy in big enterprise, especially in insurance, to a decision-centric focus. And in many ways, I think of insurance as being in the business of decisions, right? Should I underwrite this risk? How do I price this risk? How do I adjudicate this claim? At its core, an insurance company creates competitive advantage by its decision-making ability. And there are people inside insurance who have decades of experience making those decisions, underwriters, right? Claims adjusters. Where are they in terms of their enthusiasm / trust of Gen AI's potential to accelerate those decisions? And what will it take to garner that trust?
I think Gen AI is pretty new to most underwriters. I mean, they see what you can do with ChatGPT, right? From a just general, I can ask questions and get some answers, but how that relates to their job and how it relates to what decisions they make, I think is still pretty new territory. What I think there's a lot of excitement for is where we can use Gen AI or any AI to automate the tasks that they don't like doing, right? And there's a lot of tasks our underwriters don't like doing. Keying in data into a screen, not fun. Going and searching the internet to find a relevant example of some sort of loss, right? Not fun. If we can use Gen AI to assist the underwriters, I think that's a great way to introduce it and help them understand where it can help them with the things they don't like.
So what's your sense of, can we control Gen AI? Can we make it trustworthy? It was an interesting conversation I had with a customer the other day, and they were doing some tests of summarization, and they put it in front of underwriters, and they had large language model number one, large language model number two, and they asked them to rate these summaries. And what became very clear was they were rating this sort of floweriness of the language it was using, even though there were rampant sort of hallucinations in the longer summarization versus the other one. And I think that's sort of a human risk, right? Is if we like the way it's sort of responding, we drop our guard a bit in terms of, well, is that accurate? Is that trustworthy? So when you think about mapping back to the underlying data, does that change anything about the company's data strategy? Or is it really very similar to the way it was, say, in 2018 with any of these technologies? Is that similar, or fundamentally, are we at a fundamentally different inflection point around that data to decision continuum?
I don't think it's fundamentally different, just more complex. That there are more things that we need to understand. So not to get too technical, but for example, when you are embedding something into a large language model, you can only send so much data in. And deciding how you chunk up your unstructured data, or even what structured data to send in with that question, is a whole new field, right? And we're going to have to figure out, how do we do that effectively to get less hallucinations and better answers back from these Gen AI models?
Yeah, I think about those as sort of pools of context, right? I think with unstructured and Gen AI and things like retrieval augmented generation, the enterprise has all of these pools of context: policies in force, losses, submissions that were declined, right? Each of those is sort of a category or a pool of context that at a moment in time could be very, very useful if you know which context to apply to which question. And that's where Gen AI really shines, right? Its ability to synthesize across these pools of context, if it's asked in the right frame, is really, really powerful. Is that a difference in terms of data strategy today versus 6 years ago? When you think about unstructured, is the enterprise ready to sort of expose those pools of context, or is that something also that they have to consider to get ready to really take advantage of the decision-making capabilities of these technologies?
I can't speak for all enterprises, but implementing your data strategy is a long, hard process. Anyone who says it's easy, please come talk to me and explain to me how you did it easily. It's always the unsung hero that is making it possible for us to do this exciting stuff, right? But it takes a long time, and you really need to approach it on a use case by use case basis, because we're not going to try and go boil the ocean, right? We're not going to go out there and say, all right, unstructured data is really important for Gen AI, and everyone's talking about Gen AI, so let me go and corral all the unstructured data in my company and just classify it. But classify it for what? What do you want to do with it, right? Start with the use case and then incrementally build that up. But are we ready today? No. We have more work to do to those foundations so that we can reliably use the shiny stuff.
Another good segue. So in your role as a technology leader, where the pace of technology now is even faster, it doesn't necessarily mean the enterprise can iterate faster to keep up with it, right? The challenges still apply. Governance, regulatory still apply. But you see things like, okay, now we're talking about agent architectures and chain of reasoning and all these things where today we have to carefully architect how Gen AI is going to interact with these different pools of context, where that data came from. Can we make it explainable, traceable? What's your advice for technology leaders as this pace continues to accelerate? It's not easy for an enterprise technology leader just to say, okay, all of a sudden now we can accelerate at that same pace. So how do you think about that in terms of discussions you have with your C-suite around, can we make this a competitive advantage? Is it just keeping pace? Like where do you fall on that spectrum when you're thinking about your strategy as a technology leader?
The first thing I think about is where and how am I going to integrate these things into my existing estate? The approach is not to, I'm going to go replace my policy admin system with a generative AI policy admin system, right? That's probably not a thing yet, and I don't know it should be a thing. But our core systems, they operate the insurance value chain on our insurance data objects, right? And what they need to do is still the same thing. But where do we start to plug in these new capabilities? And from an architecture perspective, how do we plug these things in knowing that our core insurance systems, they don't need to change at the same pace that our technology around AI needs to change? So then it becomes about, how do I integrate these things through a standard interface and isolate it to the point that I can make a call and get an answer, and then maybe today I'm using this technology, and maybe tomorrow I'm using a different technology.
So we've talked a bit about safety, trustworthiness. Let's talk about security a bit. So there's a real tension around the pitch that you get from the hyperscalers, Google, Microsoft, Salesforce, any of them, which is provide us with all your data and you're going to get these incredible capabilities. True, by the way. I don't think there's anything secretive about that. Is the fear of sort of data leakage or even less data leakage, partners leveraging your data to do things with it that benefits them as much as it benefits you? Is that overblown? Is that real? How do you think about that as a technology leader in trying to calibrate the need to be secure versus the need to take advantage of these capabilities? And is that an either or is it an and today? Can you make it an and?
I think we have to make it an and we need to start by thinking about what is your security perimeter, right? And generally that's our network, right? So when the data is in our network, it is within our security perimeter. We can control that security perimeter. When the data leaves our network, now, okay, we don't necessarily have control over it, or we have less control over it. So one of the things that is interesting that we ought to be looking at is how do we bring these capabilities to the data that is in our network versus sending the data out of our network to someone else? Because now the data has gone out of our security perimeter. Even when it is in our security perimeter, it's still generally hosted on a hyperscaler, right? And so you need to be thinking about the encryption keys and who's creating and managing those encryption keys. And you need to be thinking about your users and their roles. Who has access to the data? Who has access to the compute technologies, to the AI models, to the outputs? So those are all things we need to be thinking about. When you layer Gen AI on top of that, it's just more data, more partners, but you still need to keep all those core principles there. Excellent.
All right, well, we're generating some good questions from the audience here, so I'll fire a couple of these at you, and for the last few minutes that we have here. A fair question, what is unstructured data? How do you define unstructured data? Is it notes? Is it email? What is it? How do you think about unstructured data?
Oh, that's such a great question. Start by defining what is structured data. So structured data is where we have defined what the data means, and we are able to put the data into that structure. We say, all right, now I can easily ask a question of the structured data by saying, if the structured data is policy, we have a policy number, we have a policy limit, I can say, how many policies do I have? Right? I can count the policy numbers. I can say, what is my exposure by looking at the policy limits. Unstructured data is the opposite of that. So it is where we don't have the data predefined in a structure that we know how to query. So a lot of what we're trying to do with unstructured data is one of two things. Either I want to interact with it in a real-time basis because I don't know what's in there, right? So I want to be able to ask questions of that unstructured data, which could be an email, it could be a PDF, it could be a spreadsheet, right? Sometimes we call that semi-structured data. But I want
even imagery, right now, satellite imagery,
yep,
photos,
satellite,
all those things.
Absolutely. Anything that is not necessarily well-defined and known up front. I said you want to ask questions of it. The other thing you might want to do is not have an interactive asking questions, but actually mine that data before someone wants to ask a question. Because it is expensive to ask questions of unstructured data in real time.
This is sort of a related question. How good do you think insurers are at knowing what data to keep and what data to throw away? Is that a solved problem or is that an unsolved problem?
That is an unsolved problem. And it depends on who you ask. If you talk to an actuary, they want all the data forever and ever and ever. If you talk to your compliance department, get rid of it all. If you talk to security, no data is the securest thing you can have. So you have a lot of different stakeholders, and you really need to weigh and balance the needs of the business to do their job with the needs of the people that deal with regulators to explain why we're not doing bad things.
Yeah, and I think for a while, the example I always use is in the underwriting submission process. Insurance companies will quote maybe a third of those submissions, right, and bind some a subset of that. And I think for a long time, the declined stuff was just sort of like, well, we don't need this, right? We declined it. But it turns out that what you decline is as interesting as what you approve as a long-term data asset. And now, with these new technologies giving you the ability to sort of interrogate that unstructured data, well, all of a sudden, that could become a competitive advantage. What's in those declined submissions that maybe are the makings of a new product we could offer if we had a different risk strategy, different pricing strategy. So I think it does open up some really interesting opportunities to keep data that maybe you don't in the moment think is valuable, but over time and over a collection of it could become quite valuable.
Yeah, and this is why we become hoarders, because you don't know what's going to be valuable in the future. So there is a tendency to, ooh, I want this, I want this, I want this, I want this. And the technologist in me supports that. Like, yeah, that's fun. But there are regulatory and environmental impacts of storing and processing that large volume of data.
And some cost impacts as well.
Yeah.
Good. Well, it's a deep topic. We've got lots more questions. If you'd like to continue the conversation, just come up and see us. But Steve, really enjoyed it. Thanks so much for joining us here.
Thank you, Tom.